The ancient Egyptians knew something about the soul that modern science is only beginning to confirm. They knew it was immortal. They knew it chose its incarnations deliberately. They knew it carried its full history across lifetimes, and that every life was a curriculum designed by the soul itself, for the soul itself, toward a destination the soul already knew. They encoded this knowledge in their most sacred texts, in the Book of the Dead, in the pyramid texts, in the initiatory practices of their temples, and they built their entire civilization around it. Every pyramid, every temple, every ritual, as a technology for the soul's development across time. Edgar Cayce confirmed every word of it from a trance state, without studying a single line of Egyptian text. Cayce was born in 1877 in rural Kentucky. He had no medical degree, no formal education beyond the 9th grade, no knowledge of ancient languages, no training in philosophy or theology, no access to the scholarly literature on Egyptian religion that was only beginning to be developed in his era. And yet, lying down, closing his eyes, entering a state of consciousness that his contemporaries could not explain, and that modern science still struggles to categorize. He described the nature of the soul, the mechanics of reincarnation, the purpose of karma, and the architecture of the invisible world with a precision and a consistency that researchers have been studying for nearly a century. Over 14,000 documented readings, given to thousands of different people, over more than 4 decades, internally consistent, philosophically coherent, and aligned with a precision that is almost impossible to explain as coincidence with what the ancient Egyptians had written in stone 3,000 years before Cayce was born. He was not inventing it, he was accessing it. From the same source the Egyptian priests had encoded in hieroglyphs on the walls of their most sacred chambers. The source they called the Hall of Records, the repository of the complete history of the soul's journey through the physical world. This video is about what Cayce found when he slept, and what Egypt had already written in stone, waiting for someone with the right kind of eyes to finally read it. What did the Egyptians know about your soul? What did Cayce confirm? And what does it mean for the life you're living right now? The answers begin with a single question that the Egyptian tradition placed at the center of everything. Not who are you, but what are you? Not the name, not the biography, not the body. The soul beneath all of it. The part that was here before this life and will be here after it. That is what we are about to explore. And by the end of this video, you will understand your own existence differently than you did when you began. Museum cases. But Egypt as it understood itself, as the guardian of a knowledge so fundamental, so complete, so carefully preserved across millennia, that entire civilizations were built simply to protect and transmit it. A knowledge about the soul, about what it is, where it comes from, where it goes, and why it chooses to incarnate in the particular life that each of us is living right now. Cayce spent his life accessing this knowledge from the inside, from the state of consciousness that sleep made available to him. The Egyptians spent their civilization encoding it from the outside, in stone, in text, in ritual, in the architectural proportions of their most sacred structures. They were describing the same territory from opposite sides of the veil. This is the story of what Edgar Cayce saw when he slept, and what ancient Egypt had already written in stone, thousands of years before he was born, waiting for someone with the right kind of eyes to read it. In 1923, Edgar Cayce gave a reading that changed the direction of his life and the nature of his work. Until that point, most of his readings had been focused on physical health, on diagnosing illness and recommending treatment for people who came to him seeking help with conditions that conventional medicine had failed to address. He was known in the circles that knew of him at all as a medical clairvoyant, a healer, a man with an inexplicable gift for seeing inside the body. But in 1923, a businessman named Arthur Lammers asked Cayce to give him a reading on a different kind of question. Not about health, about the soul, about reincarnation, about whether human beings live more than one life, and if so, what the larger purpose of that cycle might be. Cayce was a devout Christian. He was uncomfortable with the question. He went into his trance state with reluctance. And what came out of that trance state transformed everything. The reading that followed described in precise and unexpected detail a cosmological framework for the human soul that drew heavily on ancient Egyptian understanding, and that had no precedent in anything Cayce had consciously studied or encountered. It described past lives. It described the soul's journey between incarnations. It described the purpose of karma and the nature of spiritual evolution across multiple lifetimes. And it pointed repeatedly to ancient Egypt as the civilization that had most completely understood and encoded this knowledge. Over the following years, as Cayce continued to give readings that touched on these themes, a specific location began to appear with increasing frequency, a place that the readings described as the repository of the most complete and ancient record of human spiritual history ever compiled. A physical location somewhere in Egypt, where the knowledge of the civilization that had preceded even in Egypt, the civilization Cayce called Atlantis, had been preserved. He called it the Hall of Records. The readings described it as a chamber, buried beneath the Egyptian sands, located in the vicinity of the Sphinx, a library not of books, but of a more permanent kind of record. Crystalline tablets, Cayce said, encoded with information about the full history of the soul's journey through the physical world, the history of Atlantis, the history of the migrations that had brought Atlantean knowledge to Egypt, the history of the soul's purpose on Earth. Cayce's readings described Atlantis not as a myth, but as a historical reality, a civilization of extraordinary technological and spiritual sophistication that had reached its peak development approximately 12,000 years ago, before destroying itself through the misuse of the very knowledge and power it had developed. And before that destruction, according to the readings, certain Atlanteans, the priests, the keepers of the sacred knowledge, had carried their most essential teachings to several locations around the world. One of those locations was Egypt. The Egyptians who received this knowledge, the reading said, incorporated it into the very foundations of their civilization, into their cosmology, their religion, their initiatory practices, their architecture. The pyramids themselves were, in the Cayce readings, not primarily tombs, but initiation chambers, structures designed to facilitate precisely the kind of expanded consciousness that Cayce himself experienced in his trance state. Places where the veil between the ordinary waking mind and the deeper dimensions of consciousness could be temporarily thinned, whether or not you accept the literal reality of Atlantis. And there is room for reasonable debate on that question. What is remarkable about the Cayce readings on Egypt is their internal consistency with what Egyptologists have actually found. The emphasis on the soul's journey, the multi-layered understanding of consciousness, the role of the priest as guide through the inner world, the understanding of death not as an ending but as a transition, a passage from one state of the soul's journey to the next. Cayce did not study Egyptology. He did not read hieroglyphs. He had no access in his waking life to the scholarly literature on Egyptian religion and cosmology that was only beginning to be developed in his era. And yet, sleeping, he described the same system that the Egyptians had encoded in their most sacred texts. The same understanding of the soul, the same cosmological architecture, the same map of the inner world. He was reading from the same source, in his own way, in his own time. The ancient Egyptians had a word for the soul that has no precise equivalent in any modern language. The word was Ba, and what they meant by it was something far more complex, far more precise, and far more practically useful than anything the modern world typically means when it uses the word soul. The Ba was not simply the part of you that survives death. It was the totality of what you are, your personality, your memories, your relationships, your desires, your accumulated experience across all the lifetimes you had lived. It was the unique configuration of consciousness that makes you specifically you, as distinct from every other being in the universe. And it was understood to be mobile, capable of moving between worlds, between states of existence, between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, in ways that the ancient Egyptians documented with extraordinary care. But the Ba was only one layer of what the Egyptians understood the soul to be. Above it, deeper, more fundamental, was the Ka, the vital force, the animating energy that connects the individual soul to the universal source, the thread that runs from the particular to the infinite. And above the Ka, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say beneath, since we are moving toward foundations rather than summits, was the Ak, the luminous immortal aspect, the part of the human being that does not merely survive death but participates in the divine, the aspect that the Egyptians associated with the stars, with eternity, with the consciousness of the universe itself. 3 layers, each with its own nature, its own journey, its own requirements for development. Each understood not as abstract theological categories, but as practical realities that could be worked with, cultivated, and ultimately understood through direct experience. And beneath all 3, the ground from which all 3 arose, was something the Egyptians called Nata, the divine. Not a personal God with a name and a face and a biography, but the universal consciousness that underlies all of creation, the field of being from which every soul emerges and to which every soul in the fullness of time returns. This is the cosmological framework that the Egyptian civilization was built to transmit, and it is, in its essential structure, identical to what Edgar Cayce described in his readings on the soul. Cayce spoke of the soul as a multidimensional entity, not a simple unified thing, but a complex layered structure with different aspects that correspond to different dimensions of existence. He spoke of the soul's connection to what he called the universal consciousness, the infinite source that underlies all individual souls and from which all consciousness derives. He spoke of the soul's journey through incarnation as a process of development, of gradually bringing the individual self into alignment with the universal source. He also spoke repeatedly of Egypt as the civilization that had most clearly understood this process. In reading after reading, he described ancient Egyptian priests who had mastered what he called the mysteries, the deep knowledge of the soul's nature and the soul's journey that the public religion of Egypt encoded in mythological form, but that the initiates of the inner circle understood directly through the same kind of expanded consciousness that Cayce himself accessed in his trance state. The Book of the Dead, the Egyptian funerary text that modern scholars long interpreted as a guide for the literal journey through the underworld after death, was, in the Cayce readings, something far more significant. It was a manual for consciousness, a guide not just for dying, but for living, for navigating the different dimensions of the soul's experience, both in the physical world and beyond it. A technology for transformation that the Egyptians had developed over thousands of years and encoded in a form that would survive the inevitable collapse of the civilization that had created it. Because the Egyptians knew that civilizations fall, they knew that the knowledge they had accumulated could not be preserved in institutions or in living traditions alone. It had to be written in stone, encoded in structures that would outlast any political or social catastrophe, hidden in myths and symbols that would retain their meaning even when the people who created them were long gone. They were building, in other words, for exactly the moment we are living in now, when the knowledge would be needed again, when the soul would be searching for the map it had lost, when someone like Edgar Cayce would come along and find it, in the only place it had been waiting all along, inside. Here is the question that drove Edgar Cayce's most significant work. Not, can you heal my body? Though he answered that question thousands of times, with results that astonished physicians and researchers alike. The deeper question, the one that animated the readings, that have proven most enduring and most transformative for the people who encounter them, was this: why are you here? Not here on earth in general, here specifically, in this particular body, in this particular family, in this particular set of circumstances, with these particular gifts and these particular wounds, in this particular moment of history. Why this life and not some other? The answer that came through Cayce's readings, consistently across hundreds of separate sessions, given to hundreds of different people over a period of more than 2 decades, was not the answer that his Christian upbringing had prepared him for. It was not a simple matter of divine will or random chance. It was something far more precise, far more purposeful, and far more personal. You chose this life before you were born, from the dimension of consciousness that exists between incarnations, in full awareness of your soul's history, and in response to the specific lessons and the specific relationships that your soul needed in order to continue its development. You selected this particular configuration of circumstances as the optimal environment for what you needed to learn and to heal and to give. Reincarnation in the Cayce readings is not a punishment, and it is not a wheel of suffering from which escape is the goal. It is a curriculum, a carefully structured, soul-designed educational program that extends across many lifetimes, each one building on what came before, each one offering the specific conditions that the soul needs at that stage of its development. And the curriculum is not random. It follows principles. The most fundamental of those principles is what the readings call the law of karma, not in the punitive sense that the word has acquired in popular culture, but in its original meaning, the law of cause and effect applied to the soul's development across time. What you put into the field of your experience comes back to you, not as punishment, but as opportunity. As the precise conditions, you need to understand what you have not yet understood, to heal what you have not yet healed, to give what you have not yet given. Now here is where ancient Egypt becomes essential to understanding what Cayce was describing. Because the Egyptians did not simply believe in an afterlife. They had a precise, detailed, functionally specific understanding of the soul's journey between incarnations. A map of the invisible territory that the soul traverses between one life and the next, and a technology for navigating that territory consciously rather than being carried through it blindly. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is, at its deepest level, a guide for this navigation. The spells and prayers and declarations it contains are not magical incantations in the superstitious sense. They are orientation tools, precise statements of the soul's identity, its history, its relationships, and its intentions, designed to help the soul maintain its coherence and its direction as it moves through the dimensions of experience that lie beyond ordinary physical life. The weighing of the heart, the judgment ceremony that stands at the center of Egyptian funerary belief, is not a moral tribunal in the Western religious sense. It is a measurement, a precise assessment of whether the soul, in the life just completed, has moved toward or away from alignment with Ma'at, the divine order, the principle of truth and cosmic balance, that the Egyptians understood as the fundamental law of the universe. If the heart is heavy, burdened with the unresolved karma of choices made in conflict with Ma'at, the soul returns to the cycle of incarnation, carrying those unresolved threads into the next life as the material for its continued development. If the heart is light, if the soul has genuinely completed the work of the life just lived, it moves to the next stage of its journey. This is karma. This is reincarnation. Described 3,000 years before Edgar Cayce was born, by a civilization that had been working with these principles long enough to develop a precise and practical technology for navigating them. Cayce rediscovered this knowledge from inside his trance. The Egyptians encoded it in their most sacred texts. The knowledge is the same, the source is the same, and it concerns you directly. The life you are living right now is not random. It is the curriculum your soul designed. One of the most striking aspects of the Cayce readings on reincarnation is the consistency with which they describe what has come to be called soul contracts, the agreements that souls make between incarnations before they enter a new life, about the relationships and the circumstances that will structure that life. These are not vague impressions or general principles. They are specific. The readings describe souls who have known each other across multiple incarnations, who have entered into agreements about what they will offer each other in the next life, sometimes as sources of love and support, sometimes as sources of challenge and conflict. because both kinds of relationship serve the soul's development in essential ways. The person who has caused you the most pain in your life may, in the Cayce framework, be the soul you are most deeply connected to, the one who agreed before this life began to provide precisely the conditions that your soul needed in order to work through a pattern that has persisted across many lifetimes. This is not a comfortable idea. It is not designed to be. It is designed to be true, and it maps with remarkable precision onto something the ancient Egyptian tradition understood and taught. The Egyptian concept of the Ib, the heart, the seat of moral consciousness and memory in Egyptian belief, was understood to carry across lifetimes. The heart that is weighed at the moment of death is not a blank slate. It is the accumulated record of every choice the soul has made across every incarnation it has lived. Every relationship, every act of kindness or cruelty, every moment of courage or cowardice, every step toward or away from alignment with Mayat. And this accumulated record is not merely a balance sheet. It is a living document, a map of the soul's unfinished business, its unresolved relationships, its uncompleted lessons. And it is this map that determines, in the Egyptian understanding of the soul's journey, what the next incarnation will look like. What circumstances will be created? What relationships will be encountered? What work will be available to be done? The Egyptians did not have a word for soul contract in the modern sense, but the principle they understood, that the soul's history determines the soul's future, that the relationships of one life carry forward into the next, that the circumstances of each incarnation are not random but are shaped by the accumulated karma of what came before, is identical to what the Cayce readings described in their own language to the thousands of people who sought readings from a sleeping man in rural Virginia in the early 20th century. There is a question that arises naturally when you encounter this framework, a question that every person who seriously engages with the idea of soul contracts eventually asks. If I chose this life, if I chose these circumstances, these relationships, these challenges, then why don't I remember choosing them? Why does it feel like something that happened to me rather than something I designed? The Cayce readings have a precise answer to this question, and so, remarkably, does ancient Egypt. The answer is that the forgetting is intentional. It is part of the design. If you remembered fully and clearly the soul agreements you made before birth, if you could see the full arc of your soul's journey across multiple lifetimes, the full context of every relationship and every challenge, the experience of the current life would lose its essential quality. The lessons you came to learn require genuine engagement. They require that you face the circumstances of your life as if they are real, as if the outcomes matter, as if the choices you make have genuine consequences, which they do, just not in the limited sense that ordinary human perspective can see. The Egyptians encoded this understanding in the myth of Osiris. Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, does not simply pass through death and come back unchanged. He is dismembered, scattered, lost to himself. And it is only through the loving, searching work of Isis, the principle of wisdom and restoration, that he is gathered back together and restored to a higher form of existence than he had before the dismemberment. The forgetting is the dismemberment. The life is the search, and the wisdom that gradually awakens in the course of a life fully lived. The recognition of the patterns, the understanding of the purpose, the gradual remembering of who you really are beneath the surface of the particular story you are living. That is Isis, gathering the scattered pieces. You are not lost. You are in the middle of the gathering. Of all the questions that human beings have ever asked, none is more universal and none is more personal than this. What happens when we die? Not in the abstract. Not as a theological proposition to be debated at a comfortable distance. But really, what happens to you, specifically, to the awareness that is reading these words right now, to the particular configuration of consciousness that has accumulated all the experience and all the memory and all the love and all the grief of this one life? What happens to that when the body stops? The Cayce readings address this question more directly and with more specific detail than almost any other source in the modern era. And what they described was not the vague, generalized heaven of popular religious imagination, nor the oblivion of materialist philosophy. What they described was a process, a specific, structured sequence of experiences that the soul undergoes as it transitions from the physical dimension to the non-physical dimensions, that the readings consistently described as real, as inhabited, and as continuous with the life that preceded them. According to the readings, the immediate experience of death is not darkness or void. It is for most souls a gradual clearing, a lifting of the density that the physical body imposes on consciousness, a return to a state of awareness that is, in some respects, more expansive than what the physical brain and nervous system allow. Many people who have had near-death experiences describe exactly this, the sense of liberation, of expanded awareness, of a quality of consciousness that feels more real than ordinary waking experience. But the Cayce readings go further than most accounts of near-death experience. They describe what happens next, after the initial transition, as the soul moves into the dimensions of experience that exist between incarnations. The readings describe a period of review. The soul, in the non-physical state, has access to the full record of the life just completed, not as it was experienced subjectively, but as it actually was. Every moment, every choice, every relationship, every impact the soul had on every other being it encountered. This is not a judgment in the sense of a verdict pronounced by an external authority. It is a comprehensive self-examination, the soul understanding, with a clarity that the limited perspective of ordinary life does not allow exactly what it accomplished and what it did not accomplish, what it healed and what it left unhealed, what gifts it gave and what gifts it withheld. And here, once again, ancient Egypt appears with a map that predates the Cayce readings by thousands of years and describes the same territory with the same essential accuracy. The Egyptian concept of the Duat, the hidden dimension, the realm that exists behind and beneath the visible world, was not simply a geographical location somewhere in the afterlife. It was a dimension of consciousness, a state of awareness in which the full reality of the soul's journey becomes visible, in which the veil that separates the ordinary waking mind from the deeper dimensions of its own experience temporarily lifts, and the soul can see itself clearly for what it is. The 12 gates of the Duat, the 12 hours of the night through which Ra travels in Egyptian cosmology, correspond in the most sophisticated interpretations of Egyptian religion to 12 stages of the soul's self-examination after death. 12 encounters with different aspects of its own history, its own karma, its own unfinished business. 12 opportunities to understand, to integrate, and to prepare for what comes next. What comes next, in both the Cayce framework and the Egyptian understanding, is a period of rest and assimilation. The soul integrates what it has just experienced, absorbs the lessons of the life just completed, and prepares for what comes next. When the time is right, the process of preparing for the next incarnation begins. The soul does not fall randomly into a new body. It chooses, guided by unresolved karma and soul contracts with other souls. It selects the circumstances that will best serve its continued development, and then it forgets and begins again. This is the cycle Cayce described. This is the cycle the Egyptians encoded. This is the cycle you are in the middle of right now. The fact that you are encountering this information, that something in you responded with curiosity rather than fear, is itself a signal. The soul remembers more than the mind knows. Why Egypt? Of all the ancient civilizations that have left records of their understanding of the soul, and there are many, why does Egypt appear again and again as the one that understood it most completely? Why did the Cayce readings return to Egypt with such consistency across hundreds of separate sessions as the source of the deepest and most accurate knowledge of the soul's nature and the soul's journey? The answer in the Cayce readings is historical. Egypt was, according to the readings, the primary recipient of the spiritual knowledge of Atlantis, the civilization that had developed the most sophisticated understanding of consciousness in the ancient world before destroying itself. When Atlantis fell, its priests carried their knowledge to several locations. But Egypt received the most complete transmission. Egypt was built from its very foundations on the Atlantean understanding of the soul. Whether you accept the literal history of Atlantis as the Cayce readings describe it, the deeper point stands. Ancient Egypt was a civilization whose entire structure, political, artistic, architectural, religious, philosophical, was organized around a single central understanding that the soul is real, that it is immortal, that it has a journey that extends far beyond any single lifetime, and that the purpose of human civilization is to support that journey, to create the conditions in which souls can develop as fully as possible during their time in the physical world. This is why the Egyptians built the pyramids, not as monuments to royal vanity, not as tombs in the ordinary sense, but as instruments, structures whose geometry, whose acoustics, whose electromagnetic properties were precisely calibrated to facilitate the expansion of consciousness that the soul's development requires. The Great Pyramid of Giza, in the Cayce readings, was built as an initiation chamber, a place where carefully prepared initiates could undergo the experience of temporary death and rebirth that lies at the heart of every ancient mystery tradition, a place where the soul could be trained to navigate the dimensions it would encounter after physical death while still in the physical body, so that the transition of death, when it came, would not be a journey into the unknown, but a return to familiar territory. This is also why the Egyptians created the Book of the Dead, not as a funerary text in the conventional sense, but as a navigation manual, a guide for the soul's journey through the duat, the hidden dimension, that would allow the soul to maintain its coherence and its direction in the expanded state of consciousness that death makes available. And this is why, of all the ancient civilizations, Egypt's knowledge has proven the most durable. The pyramids still stand. The texts have survived. The symbols continue to speak to something deep in the human psyche. Something that recognizes, even without being able to explain why, that these structures and these images contain something real, something that matters, something that concerns not just the distant past, but the present moment, not just ancient souls, but the soul that is reading these words right now. Edgar Cayce understood this. In his readings, he consistently described Egypt not as a historical artifact, but as a living resource, a tradition that had encoded, in its most enduring forms, the knowledge that humanity would need at exactly the moment when the cycle of forgetting reached its end and the cycle of remembering began. That moment in the Cayce readings corresponds to the period we are now living in. The readings, given in the first half of the 20th century, described a coming time of transformation, a period in which the knowledge that had been lost or suppressed or forgotten would begin to resurface, in which the questions about the soul's nature and the soul's journey would become urgent again, not just for spiritual seekers, but for humanity as a whole, in which the convergence of ancient wisdom and modern science would begin to make visible what had always been true, but had not always been legible. We are living in that convergence. The physics of consciousness, the neuroscience of near-death experience, the cross-cultural study of past life memories in children, the quantum mechanics of non-locality, all of it is pointing toward the same conclusion that Egypt encoded and Cayce described. The soul is real, its journey is real, and the civilization that understood this most completely left its knowledge written in stone, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. That moment is now. Edgar Cayce died on January 3rd, 1945, in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He was 67 years old. He had spent more than 4 decades giving readings from a state of consciousness that no one around him could fully explain, accessing knowledge that he did not possess in his waking life, describing with precision the inner landscape of thousands of souls he had never met. In the final years of his life, as the demands on his time and his energy exceeded what his physical body could sustain, he gave readings at a pace that his doctors warned would kill him. He knew it. He continued anyway, because the letters kept coming from people who had nowhere else to turn, from people whose lives had been changed by what he had told them, from people who had found in his readings the one thing that modern medicine and modern religion had failed to provide them: a framework that made sense of their lives. Not a framework that made life easy. Not a framework that removed the difficulty or the grief or the confusion, but a framework that located the difficulty and the grief and the confusion within a larger story. A story that had purpose, that had direction, that had meaning. A story in which nothing that happened to you was random, in which the hardest things were also the most important things, in which the people who caused you pain were also, in some dimension of the truth, the ones who loved you most. That framework, in the Cayce readings and in the Egyptian tradition that the readings consistently pointed to as its source, is what we have been exploring in this video. And now, at the end of it, the question that remains is the same question that Cayce himself was always ultimately addressing. Not a philosophical question, not a historical question, a personal one. What does this mean for you? For the life you're living right now, with its specific configuration of relationships and circumstances and challenges and gifts, for the things you are struggling with, the patterns you keep encountering, the questions you cannot stop asking. It means, first of all, that you are not lost. The life you're living is not a random sequence of events happening to a passive recipient. It is a curriculum. It is a set of precisely calibrated conditions that your soul, in its wisdom, selected as the optimal environment for what it needs to learn and to heal and to give in this particular phase of its journey. The difficulty is not a mistake. The confusion is not a failure. The grief is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is evidence that something important is in process. It means, second, that the relationships in your life, especially the difficult ones, especially the ones that have caused you the most pain, are not accidents. They are soul agreements, souls you have known before, in other configurations, in other circumstances, who are offering you, in the form of love or challenge or both, exactly what your soul needs in order to continue its development. This does not mean you must accept mistreatment or remain in harmful situations. It means you can relate to even the most difficult relationships with a quality of curiosity rather than only with pain, asking what this relationship is here to teach, what pattern it is here to complete, what healing it is here to make possible. And it means, third, that death is not the end. Not in the sentimental sense that people sometimes use that phrase to console themselves in grief, but in the precise, functional, practically significant sense that the Cayce readings and the Egyptian tradition both describe. The awareness that you are, the specific, irreplaceable configuration of consciousness that makes you you, does not cease when the body stops. It continues, it reviews, it rests, it prepares. And in the fullness of time, it returns, carrying forward the threads of this life into the next chapter of a story that is far longer and far richer than any single lifetime can contain. Edgar Cayce spent his life accessing this knowledge in the only way he knew how, by going to sleep and letting the deeper dimensions of his consciousness speak. Ancient Egypt spent its civilization encoding this knowledge in the only way it knew how, by writing it in stone that would outlast every empire. Both of them were trying to tell you the same thing. You are more than you think you are. Your life has more meaning than you can see from inside it. And the soul that chose this particular life, with all its difficulty and all its beauty, knew exactly what it was doing. Trust it. This is Sacred Flame TV. If this opens something in you, share it with someone who's asking the same questions. Some knowledge belongs to everyone. Music by Pavel Bekirov from Pixabay.